Anaximander begins his philosophy with a question that moves beyond the visible surface of things, asking not just what the world is made of, but what lies beneath all particular forms, beneath earth, water, air, and fire, beneath everything that appears and disappears. Where earlier thinkers tried to identify a specific substance as the foundation of reality, he takes a different path. He suggests that the origin of all things cannot itself be any of the things we see. If the world is constantly changing, if things come into being and pass away, then the source from which they emerge must be something more fundamental, something that is not limited in the same way. It cannot be a specific element, because every specific thing has boundaries, and what has boundaries cannot explain everything. From this insight, he introduces the idea of the boundless, often understood as the indefinite or the infinite. This is not a thing in the ordinary sense. It does not have a clear shape, form, or limit. It is not water, not air, not fire, not earth, but something deeper that gives rise to all of them. It is the source from which all things emerge and to which they eventually return. This idea changes the way reality is understood. Instead of being built from a single visible substance, the world is seen as arising from something that cannot be directly observed, something that is always present but never fully defined. The boundless is not static. It is active, continuously generating the world through a process that is both ordered and ongoing. From this boundless origin, opposites begin to emerge. Hot and cold, wet and dry, light and dark, all arise as distinctions within what was originally undifferentiated. These opposites do not exist independently. They are part of a dynamic process where each comes into being through separation and contrast. This process is not random. It follows a kind of necessity, a structure in which things take form, exist for a time, and then dissolve back into the boundless. There is a rhythm to this movement, a cycle of emergence and return that defines the nature of existence. Anaximander introduces a striking way of describing this cycle. He suggests that things pay a kind of penalty for their existence, not in a moral sense, but in the sense that any individual form, by separating itself from the boundless, creates an imbalance. Over time, this imbalance is corrected as the form dissolves and returns to the source. This idea does not imply wrongdoing. It reflects a deeper principle of balance. Nothing remains permanently separated. Everything that comes into being must eventually pass away, restoring the equilibrium of the whole. In this way, change is not accidental. It is necessary for maintaining the overall order. This perspective brings a new level of abstraction into philosophy. The focus is no longer on identifying a single substance, but on understanding a process. Reality is not made of fixed elements alone, but of continuous transformation arising from an underlying source that cannot be reduced to any one form. At the same time, this process gives rise to the structure of the world as it is experienced. The Earth, for example, is not supported by anything in the traditional sense. It exists in balance, positioned within a larger system rather than resting on a foundation. This reflects the idea that stability comes from equilibrium, not from being fixed in place. The cosmos itself is understood as an ordered arrangement, where celestial bodies move in patterns that reflect this underlying structure. The sun, the moon, and the stars are not random lights in the sky, but part of a system governed by principles that can be observed and studied. This shift toward explanation through structure rather than myth marks an important development. The world is no longer explained through stories of divine intervention alone, but through patterns that can be understood through observation and reasoning. The boundless remains beyond direct perception, but its effects can be seen in the way the world operates. Within this framework, human life becomes part of a larger process. Just as all things emerge from the boundless and return to it, human existence is not separate from this cycle. Life is a phase within a continuous movement, shaped by the same principles that govern everything else. This creates a different sense of perspective. Individual existence is not isolated or permanent, but part of a broader unfolding. What appears as beginning and end is part of a larger continuity that extends beyond any single moment. At the same time, this does not remove meaning. Instead, it situates meaning within the process itself. Understanding the nature of this process becomes a way of understanding one's place within the world. It shifts attention from seeking permanence to recognizing patterns of emergence and return. Anaximander's thought also suggests that the world we experience is only one expression of a larger potential. The boundless is not exhausted by any single form. It contains within it the possibility for countless forms to arise, each existing for a time before giving way to others. This introduces a sense of openness to reality. The world is not fixed or final. It is continually being generated, shaped by the same underlying source. What exists now is part of a much larger and ongoing process. As this perspective develops, the focus moves away from the search for a single, stable foundation in the ordinary sense, and toward an understanding of how stability and change coexist. Stability arises from balance within change, and change arises from the tension between emerging opposites. This creates a vision of reality that is both dynamic and ordered, where everything is connected through its origin in the boundless, and where the movement of things follows a pattern that maintains the coherence of the whole. In this way, Anaximander presents a philosophy that moves beyond the visible, beyond specific substances, and into a deeper inquiry about the source of all things, revealing a world that is continuously emerging, continuously dissolving, and always grounded in something that cannot be limited, defined, or fully contained. As this idea of the boundless settles more deeply into the structure of thought, the focus begins to shift from the origin of things to the process by which distinct forms actually come into being. Because for Anaximander, it is not enough to say that everything emerges from an indefinite source. One must also understand how differentiation happens, how something without clear boundaries gives rise to a world filled with defined shapes, qualities, and opposites. The key to this lies in the notion of separation. The boundless does not produce things in a simple or direct way. Instead, it undergoes a kind of internal differentiation where opposites begin to distinguish themselves from one another. What was once undivided becomes structured through contrast. Hot separates from cold, dry from wet, light from dark. These are not merely qualities added to things. They are the very conditions that make distinct forms possible. This process of separation introduces tension into the structure of reality. Opposites do not exist in isolation. They interact, limit one another, and define each other's boundaries. The emergence of one implies the presence of the other. Heat is understood in relation to cold, dryness in relation to moisture. Without this relational structure, no particular thing could take shape. At the same time, this differentiation does not result in permanent divisions. The opposites remain connected through the process from which they arise. They continue to interact, influence, and transform one another. What emerges as distinct is always in the process of changing, moving toward a rebalancing that reflects the underlying unity of the boundless. This leads to a more detailed understanding of the cycle of existence. Things come into being through the temporary dominance of certain qualities. A form exists because a particular balance of opposites has been established, but this balance is never fixed. Over time, it shifts. What was once dominant becomes less so, and the form begins to dissolve. This dissolution is not a failure or an accident. It is a necessary part of the process. By returning to the boundless, the imbalance created by separation is resolved. The system restores itself, allowing new forms to emerge. In this way, the world is not a static arrangement of objects, but a continuous cycle of formation and dissolution. Anaximander's idea that things pay a penalty for their existence can be understood more clearly here. It is not a moral judgment, but a description of this process. Any form that separates itself from the undifferentiated whole creates a kind of imbalance. Over time, that imbalance is corrected through dissolution, restoring equilibrium. This introduces a principle of justice or balance within nature itself. It is not imposed from outside, but arises from the structure of reality. Nothing can remain in a state of excess indefinitely. The system continually adjusts, ensuring that no single element or quality dominates permanently. This principle can be observed in many aspects of the natural world. Cycles of growth and decay, changes in climate, and shifts in conditions all reflect a movement toward balance. What appears as instability is often part of a larger process of correction, where extremes are gradually brought back into proportion. At the same time, this process suggests that the world is governed by necessity rather than randomness. Events do not occur without structure. They follow patterns that, while complex, are consistent with the underlying principles of emergence and return. Understanding these patterns becomes a way of understanding the world itself. Anaximander also extends this reasoning into his view of the cosmos. The arrangement of celestial bodies is not arbitrary. It reflects the same principles of balance and proportion that govern all forms. The sun, the moon, and the stars move within a system that maintains its coherence through the interaction of forces rather than through fixed supports. His idea that the Earth remains suspended without support is particularly significant. It suggests that stability does not require a foundation in the traditional sense. Instead, it can arise from equilibrium, from a balance of forces that hold something in place without the need for physical support. This marks an important shift in thinking. It replaces the need for external explanation with an internal one. The world is not held together by something outside of it, but by the relationships within it. This idea opens the way for a more systematic understanding of nature, where explanations are sought in patterns rather than in external causes. At the same time, Anaximander's thought introduces the possibility that the world we experience is not the only one. If the boundless is truly indefinite and inexhaustible, then it can give rise to multiple worlds, not just a single cosmos. Each world would emerge, exist for a time, and then dissolve, making way for others. This idea expands the scale of reality beyond immediate perception. The universe is no longer a closed system with a single beginning and end, but part of a larger, ongoing process. What exists now is one expression among many, shaped by the same underlying principles. Within this broader perspective, human life takes on a different position. It is not central in the sense of being the purpose of everything, but it is not insignificant either. It is part of the same process that governs all forms. The same principles of emergence, balance, and return apply at the level of human existence. This creates a sense of continuity between the individual and the cosmos. Human life is not separate from nature, but an expression of it. The patterns that shape the world also shape the conditions of life, the changes one experiences, and the eventual return to the source. At the same time, this perspective encourages a different way of understanding change. Instead of seeing change as something that disrupts stability, it becomes the mechanism through which stability is maintained. Without change, imbalances would persist. With change, the system continually adjusts. This leads to a more dynamic view of reality, where stability and change are not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same process. Stability arises from the continuous correction of imbalance, and change is the means by which that correction occurs. As this understanding deepens, the world begins to appear less like a collection of separate objects and more like an interconnected system of processes. Everything that exists is part of a larger movement, shaped by the same principles and connected through the same origin. In this way, Anaximander moves further beyond the idea of a simple foundation and toward a comprehensive vision of reality as an ongoing process grounded in the boundless, where forms arise through differentiation, persist through temporary balance, and return through necessary dissolution, maintaining the coherence of the whole. As this understanding of emergence, balance, and return becomes more refined, The philosophy begins to move beyond the visible mechanics of the world and toward a deeper question about intelligibility itself. Because for Anaximander, it is not only important that things arise from the boundless, but that this process can be understood as ordered rather than chaotic. The boundless, though indefinite, is not without structure. It gives rise to a world that can be known, traced, and thought about in consistent ways. This introduces a subtle but important shift. The boundless is not simply an unlimited reservoir from which things randomly appear. It is the ground of a process that unfolds with a kind of necessity. Even though it cannot be fully defined, its activity results in patterns that can be recognized. The world, in all its variation, reflects this hidden consistency. From here, attention turns to how order manifests across different scales. The same principles that govern the formation of basic opposites extend into more complex structures. What begins as a simple differentiation between hot and cold, or wet and dry, develops into systems where these qualities combine in different proportions, producing the variety of forms that populate the world. This layered structure suggests that reality is not built in a single step, but through stages. Each stage introduces greater complexity while still being rooted in the same underlying process. The boundless does not create finished forms instantly. It allows them to emerge gradually through interactions that build upon one another. This gradual emergence gives rise to the possibility of development, not just in isolated objects, but in entire systems. The world is not fixed at a single level of organization. It evolves, not in the sense of moving toward a predetermined goal, but in the sense of continuously generating new configurations from the same basic principles. Anaximander's reflections on life can be understood within this framework. Life itself is not separate from the processes that govern the rest of nature. It arises from the same interactions of opposites, the same balancing of conditions. What appears as living is a particular arrangement of elements held in a temporary equilibrium. This idea leads to an early form of thinking about the origins of living beings. Instead of seeing life as something introduced from outside, it is understood as emerging from natural processes. Conditions within the world give rise to forms that are capable of sustaining themselves for a time, before eventually dissolving like all other things. This perspective removes the sharp boundary between living and non-living. Both are part of the same continuum. The difference lies not in their origin, but in the complexity of their organization. Life is a more intricate expression of the same principles that govern all forms. At the same time, this continuity extends to human beings. Human life is not placed outside of nature or above it. It is part of the same system, shaped by the same processes, and subject to the same cycle of emergence and return. This challenges the tendency to see human existence as fundamentally separate from the rest of the world. Within this framework, human understanding becomes part of the very process it seeks to comprehend. The mind, which attempts to grasp the structure of reality, is itself a product of that structure. This creates a kind of reflection, where the world gives rise to a being capable of recognizing the world's own patterns. This recognition is not complete or final. Just as the boundless cannot be fully defined, the understanding of it remains partial. The mind can trace patterns, identify structures, and recognize cycles, but cannot reduce everything to a single, fully graspable form. There is always an element that remains beyond precise definition. This does not undermine knowledge. It defines its limits. Understanding becomes an ongoing activity rather than a finished state. The goal is not to eliminate all uncertainty, but to engage with the patterns that can be known while recognizing that the source of those patterns remains indefinite. This balance between clarity and limitation is reflected in the way Anaximander approaches explanation. He does not rely on myth or narrative to account for the world, but neither does he claim complete knowledge. Instead, he offers a framework that allows for consistent reasoning while acknowledging what cannot be fully specified. As this framework develops, the concept of balance becomes even more central. It is not only a feature of physical processes, but a principle that applies to understanding itself. Just as the world maintains equilibrium through the interaction of opposites, thought maintains coherence by balancing what is known with what remains open. This idea can be extended to how one approaches change. Change is not something to be eliminated or feared, but something to be understood as part of the structure of reality. The same processes that bring things into being also transform them. Stability is never absolute. It is always relative to a particular moment within a larger flow. Recognizing this creates a shift in perspective. Instead of seeking fixed foundations in the ordinary sense, one begins to see that the only true foundation is the process itself. The boundless is not a stable object, but a continuous source of transformation. It supports reality not by remaining still, but by constantly generating change. At the same time, this does not lead to a sense of disorder. The presence of recurring patterns, cycles, and balances ensures that the world remains intelligible. Even though individual forms are temporary, the structure of their emergence and return is consistent. This consistency allows for a deeper kind of understanding, one that does not depend on fixed objects, but on recognizing relationships. What matters is not only what things are, but how they come into being, how they interact, and how they change over time. As this way of seeing becomes more established, the world appears less like a collection of isolated entities and more like a continuous process of differentiation and reintegration. Boundaries between things become less rigid, not because they disappear, but because they are understood as temporary distinctions within a larger whole. This perspective also reshapes the sense of time. Time is no longer just a sequence of moments, but part of the process through which balance is maintained. The past, present, and future are connected through cycles of emergence and return, each phase contributing to the overall coherence of the system. In this way, Anaximander's philosophy continues to deepen, moving from the initial insight of the boundless toward a comprehensive vision where reality is understood as a structured yet indefinite process, where forms arise through differentiation, persist through temporary balance, and dissolve through necessity, all within a system that remains intelligible even as it resists complete definition. As this vision reaches its fullest depth, everything begins to gather into a single, continuous understanding where the boundless, the emergence of opposites, and the cycles of balance and return are no longer separate ideas, but aspects of one unified process. What first appeared as an abstract origin now reveals itself as the living ground of all reality, not distant or detached, but present in every transformation, in every form that arises and passes away. The boundless is not something that existed only at the beginning. It is always active. It does not stand behind the world as a finished cause, but continues to generate, sustain, and absorb all things. Every moment is an expression of it. Every form, no matter how stable it appears, is a temporary configuration within its indefinite depth. This changes the way existence itself is understood. Reality is no longer seen as a collection of stable objects placed within a fixed structure. Instead, it becomes a continuous movement where forms emerge through differentiation, hold together through balance, and dissolve as that balance shifts. What exists is not fixed being, but ongoing becoming, structured yet never final. Within this movement, opposites play a central and unavoidable role. They are not flaws or disturbances, but the very means through which the world takes shape. Without the separation of hot and cold, light and dark, dry and wet, there would be no distinction, no form, no world as it is experienced. Yet these opposites never fully detach from one another. They remain connected, always tending toward rebalancing. This rebalancing is what gives rise to the sense of order within change. It is not imposed from outside, nor does it require a conscious force directing it. It arises from the structure of the process itself. Whenever a particular quality dominates, the conditions for its limitation are already present. Over time, excess gives way to correction, and imbalance moves back toward equilibrium. In this sense, what appears as disorder often belongs to a larger order that is not immediately visible. A period of instability may be part of a process that restores balance. A phase of growth may contain within it the beginning of decline. These are not contradictions, but phases within a continuous cycle that maintains the coherence of the whole. This deeper order does not eliminate uncertainty. The specific forms that arise, the exact paths they take, and the duration of their existence remain open. The boundless does not produce a single fixed pattern, but allows for variation within structure. It is both generative and indefinite, creating a world that is ordered yet not rigidly predetermined. From this perspective, the cosmos itself becomes something far more expansive than a single, isolated system. It is one expression among many possible expressions of the boundless. Worlds may emerge, develop, and dissolve, each following the same fundamental principles, yet each taking on different forms. The universe is not closed, but part of a larger, ongoing unfolding. Within this vast process, human existence takes on a different significance. It is neither central in the sense of controlling the whole, nor insignificant in the sense of being disconnected from it. It is a moment within the same movement, shaped by the same forces, and participating in the same cycles of emergence and return. This creates a shift in how life is understood. Instead of seeking permanence in a world that does not allow it, one begins to recognize that impermanence is not a defect, but a condition of existence. What matters is not holding on to forms, but understanding the processes that give rise to them and carry them forward. At the same time, this understanding does not lead to detachment in a cold or indifferent sense. It leads to clarity. When one sees that everything arises from the same source and returns to it, the divisions between things begin to soften. What appears separate is understood as connected through its origin and its destiny. This awareness brings a different kind of stability, not based on fixed structures, but on recognizing the continuity within change. Even as forms shift, the process remains. Even as particular things pass away, the underlying movement continues. Stability is found not in resisting change, but in understanding its role within the whole. There is also a deepening of the idea of justice or balance within nature. This is no longer limited to the simple correction of excess, but becomes a fundamental feature of reality. Everything participates in a system where no single element can dominate indefinitely. Balance is not an ideal imposed from outside, but a necessity that arises from the structure of existence itself. This principle extends to how one understands time. Time is not merely a sequence of events, but the unfolding of this process of balance and return. Each moment is connected to what came before and what will follow, forming a continuous flow where emergence and dissolution are always present. As this understanding becomes more complete, the search for a final, unchanging foundation begins to dissolve. The boundless is not a foundation in the traditional sense. It does not provide a fixed point that everything rests upon. Instead, it is the source of movement itself, the indefinite ground from which all structure arises. This leads to a final shift in perspective. Reality is not something that can be fully captured in a single definition or reduced to a fixed principle. It is a process that can be understood through its patterns, but never exhausted by them. The boundless remains beyond complete determination, even as it gives rise to everything that can be known. In this state of understanding, there's a kind of quiet coherence. The world no longer appears as a collection of disconnected or unstable parts, but as a continuous unfolding where everything has its place within the larger process. Change is no longer something that disrupts meaning, but something that makes meaning possible. What remains is not a final answer, but a way of seeing. A recognition that everything that exists emerges from an indefinite source, takes form through differentiation, persists through temporary balance, and returns through necessity, all within a system that is both structured and open, ordered yet without fixed limits. In the end, Anaximander presents a vision where the deepest truth is not found in any particular thing, but in the process that gives rise to all things, where the boundless stands not as an object to be grasped, but as the ever-present ground of becoming, and where understanding comes not from holding on to what appears, but from recognizing the patterns through which everything comes into being, transforms, and returns once again. Anaximander was born around 610 BCE in the city of Miletus, a place that stood at the edge of a changing world. Trade routes passed through it, ideas moved across it, and cultures met within it. It was one of the early centers where people began to question not just how things appear, but what lies beneath those appearances. This was the beginning of philosophy in a form that tried to move beyond myth, beyond stories of gods controlling every event, towards something more structured, more rational, and more grounded in observation. He was a student of Thales, who is often credited as one of the first to search for a fundamental principle behind all things. Thales had suggested that everything comes from water, a bold step at the time, because it attempted to reduce the complexity of the world to a single underlying substance. But Anaximander did not simply accept this idea. He took it as a starting point and pushed it further, questioning not just what the world is made of, but whether any known substance could truly explain everything. This question led him to one of the most unusual and influential ideas in early philosophy. He proposed that the origin of everything is not something familiar like water, air, or earth, but something indefinite, something without clear boundaries or specific qualities. He called this the apeiron. The apeiron is not a substance in the ordinary sense. It is not something that can be seen, touched, or directly experienced. It is limitless, undefined, and without fixed form. Yet, according to his view, it is the source from which all things emerge and to which all things return. This idea marks a significant shift in thinking. Instead of trying to explain the world through something visible and concrete, he moves towards something abstract, something that cannot be reduced to ordinary experience. It suggests that the foundation of reality may not be immediately accessible, that what is most fundamental lies beyond what is directly observed. From this indefinite source, he believed that opposites begin to separate. Heat and cold, dry and wet. These contrasting forces emerge and interact, creating the world as it is experienced. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is part of a process where opposing elements come into balance, fall out of balance, and then return again. This introduces a dynamic view of reality. The world is not static. It is constantly shifting through the interaction of these opposing forces. But unlike later thinkers who would emphasize conflict, Anaximander places more focus on balance and restoration. He describes this process almost as if it follows a kind of justice. When one force becomes too dominant, it is eventually corrected. The imbalance does not remain permanent. It is restored over time, as if the structure of reality itself resists excess. This idea of balance adds a deeper layer to his thinking. It suggests that the world is not random, even if it appears unpredictable. There's a kind of order not imposed from outside, but built into the way things emerge and interact. At the same time, he extended his thinking beyond abstract principles into observations about the natural world. He attempted to describe the structure of the cosmos in a way that did not rely on myth. He proposed that the earth is not supported by anything, but remains in place because it is at the center, equally distant from everything else. This idea may seem simple, but at the time it represented a major shift. It removed the need for physical support or divine intervention to explain why the earth does not fall. Instead, it introduced a kind of balance based on position and symmetry. He also made early attempts to explain the origins of life in natural terms. He suggested that living beings may have emerged from simpler forms, possibly from moisture, and that humans themselves may have developed from earlier creatures. This was not a detailed theory in the modern sense, but it reflects an important shift toward explaining life as part of a natural process rather than a separate creation. What becomes clear through all of this is that his thinking moves consistently in one direction, away from concrete, familiar explanations, and toward deeper, more abstract principles. He is not satisfied with what is immediately visible. He is searching for what makes visibility possible in the first place. At the same time, his philosophy does not offer simple clarity. The apeiron, as the source of everything, remains undefined. It cannot be fully described or fully understood in ordinary terms. This creates a kind of tension within his thought. The desire to explain the world meets the recognition that its foundation may not be fully accessible. By the time his early ideas had taken shape, he had already introduced a way of thinking that would influence generations to come. A move toward abstraction, toward underlying principles that cannot be reduced to simple elements, and toward a view of reality as a process rather than a fixed structure. And in doing so, he left behind a philosophy that does not settle for easy answers, but instead points towards something deeper, something that exists beyond the limits of direct experience, yet shapes everything that can be seen. As his thinking continued to develop, what becomes increasingly clear is that Anaximander was not only trying to explain what the world is made of, but how it maintains itself over time. His idea of the apeiron as an indefinite, boundless source begins to take on a deeper role. It is not simply the origin of things. It is also what allows the continuous process of change, balance, and renewal to exist at all. He moves beyond the question of beginnings and starts focusing on process. If everything comes from the apeiron, then everything must also exist within a kind of ongoing cycle. Nothing remains fixed. Things emerge, take form, interact, and eventually dissolve back into the indefinite. This movement is not chaotic or meaningless. It follows a kind of structure, even if that structure is not immediately visible. This is where his idea of balance becomes more precise. He does not describe balance as a static condition where everything remains equal at all times. Instead, it is something that is constantly being restored. Opposites do not simply coexist peacefully. They compete, they push against each other, and when one becomes too dominant, the system corrects itself. He describes this process using a kind of moral language, speaking of justice and reparation. When one element exceeds its proper limit, it must eventually pay back what it has taken. This is not morality in a human sense, but a way of expressing that the structure of reality does not allow permanent imbalance. This idea introduces a powerful way of understanding change. It is not random. It is regulated by a deeper necessity. Excess leads to correction. Dominance leads to reversal. What appears stable is often just a temporary phase within a larger movement toward balance. At the same time, this perspective changes how time itself is understood. Time is no longer just a sequence of events. It becomes part of the process through which balance is maintained. What is out of proportion in one moment is gradually brought back into alignment over time. This gives his philosophy a kind of rhythm. Reality is not a straight line, but a series of movements, expansions and contractions, dominance and decline, all unfolding within the larger framework of the apeiron. He also deepens his thinking about the structure of the cosmos. Instead of imagining the universe as something centered entirely around human experience, he begins to describe it in broader, more impersonal terms. The Earth, as he proposed, remains in place not because it is held up, but because it is balanced, equally distant from everything around it. This idea reflects a move towards symmetry as a principle of explanation. Things do not require support if they are in a position where no direction is favored over another. Balance replaces the need for physical anchors. He extended this thinking outward, suggesting that celestial bodies move in circular patterns, not randomly, but in ways that reflect an underlying order. While his descriptions were not scientifically accurate by modern standards, the method behind them was significant. He was trying to explain the cosmos without relying on myth, using reasoning and observation instead. At the same time, he continued to explore the origins of life in ways that moved further away from traditional explanations. His suggestion that life emerged from moisture and that humans developed from earlier forms reflects an attempt to see life as part of the same natural process that governs everything else. This removes the sharp distinction between living and non-living, between humans and the rest of nature. Everything becomes part of a continuous process of emergence and transformation. What makes this especially important is that it connects his abstract idea of the apeiron with observable reality. The indefinite source is not separate from the world. It expresses itself through the processes that can be seen, through growth, decay, and the ongoing movement of life. At the same time, he begins to push further into abstraction, recognizing that the most fundamental aspects of reality may not be directly accessible. The apeiron remains undefined, not because it is unclear, but because it cannot be reduced to specific qualities. This creates a kind of philosophical tension. He is seeking explanation, but the deeper he goes, the less concrete the explanation becomes. The foundation of everything is not something that can be pointed to or described in simple terms. This marks an important moment in the development of philosophy. It shows a willingness to accept that understanding may require moving beyond what is immediately graspable, beyond what can be easily visualized or explained. At the same time, he does not abandon the attempt to understand. Instead, he accepts that knowledge may be partial, that it may approach reality without fully capturing it. This introduces a more nuanced view of knowledge itself. It is not about certainty in the absolute sense. It is about moving closer to understanding, even if complete clarity remains out of reach. By this stage, his philosophy presents a world that is dynamic, structured, and deeply interconnected. Everything emerges from an indefinite source, interacts through opposing forces, and moves toward balance over time. It does not offer simple answers or fixed foundations. Instead, it offers a way of thinking that embraces complexity, that recognizes limits, and that seeks order not in static forms, but in the processes that shape and reshape reality continuously. And within that view lies a deeper implication, that what appears stable is only temporary, that imbalance is never permanent, and that beneath the surface of everything that can be seen, there exists something indefinite, something without clear boundaries, quietly giving rise to the world and drawing it back again into itself. As his thought continues to unfold, what becomes more apparent is that Anaximander was not only trying to explain the origin and structure of the world, but also trying to understand the limits of explanation itself. His idea of the apeiron begins to take on a deeper philosophical weight, not just as a source, but as a recognition that the foundation of reality may lie beyond clear definition. This creates a shift in how knowledge is approached. Earlier thinkers attempted to reduce everything to something familiar, something that could be directly observed, like water or air. But Anaximander moves in the opposite direction. He suggests that what is most fundamental may not resemble anything that can be experienced directly. This introduces a kind of intellectual humility into his philosophy. It acknowledges that human understanding has limits, and that the deeper one looks into the structure of reality, the more those limits become visible. The apeiron is not vague because he lacked clarity. It is undefined because it cannot be contained within ordinary categories. At the same time, this idea reshapes how change is understood. If everything emerges from something indefinite, then all forms are temporary by nature. Nothing has a permanent or independent existence. Everything depends on a process that lies beyond it. This perspective removes the idea of absolute beginnings and endings. What appears to begin is simply a moment where something takes form. What appears to end is a return to the indefinite. The process continues, even when specific forms disappear. This creates a view of reality that is continuous rather than fragmented. Events are not isolated. They are connected through a deeper process that does not stop, even when individual forms change. He also deepens his idea of opposites, showing that they are not just interacting forces, but part of a larger balance that must be maintained over time. Heat and cold dryness, and moisture. These are not separate elements competing randomly. They are expressions of a system that regulates itself. When one becomes too dominant, it disrupts the balance, and over time, that imbalance is corrected. This correction is not immediate. It unfolds gradually, as part of the natural movement of things. This introduces a more refined understanding of order. Order is not the absence of change or conflict. It is the process through which change and conflict are balanced. At the same time, he begins to suggest that what people perceive as disorder may simply be a lack of perspective. From a limited point of view, events may appear random or chaotic, but from a broader perspective, they may fit into a larger pattern that is not immediately visible. This idea challenges the tendency to judge based on immediate experience. It suggests that understanding requires stepping back, considering longer processes, and recognizing that not all structure is visible at once. He also continues to expand his view of the cosmos, treating it not as something centered around human experience, but as a system that exists independently of it. The Earth, in his model, is not the focus of everything, but part of a larger arrangement. This shift is subtle but important. It removes the assumption that human perspective defines reality. Instead, reality is something that exists on its own terms, and human understanding must adjust to it. He further develops his ideas about the origins of life, suggesting that life emerges from conditions that are part of the natural world, rather than from separate or supernatural causes. This reinforces the idea that everything follows the same underlying principles, that there is no sharp division between different kinds of existence. This creates a more unified view of reality. The same processes that shape the cosmos also shape life. The same balance of forces operates at every level. At the same time, he becomes more aware of the gap between this deeper structure and everyday understanding. Most people, in his view, do not engage with these questions. They experience the results of these processes without considering the processes themselves. This creates a kind of separation between appearance and reality. What is visible is only a small part of what is happening. The deeper structure remains hidden unless one actively seeks to understand it. By this stage, his philosophy presents a world that is both structured and elusive. It is governed by principles, but those principles are not always accessible in a clear or direct way. It requires a different kind of thinking, one that is willing to move beyond immediate perception, to accept abstraction, and to engage with ideas that do not fit easily into familiar categories. And within that way of thinking lies a deeper shift. The recognition that understanding is not about finding a final, simple answer, but about moving closer to a reality that remains more complex than any single explanation can fully capture. Because once it becomes clear that the foundation of everything is not something fixed or easily defined, the search for certainty begins to change. It becomes less about holding on to clear conclusions and more about learning to navigate a world where structure exists but is not always visible, and where what lies beneath everything remains indefinite, yet essential to everything that appears. As his life moved toward its final phase, what becomes increasingly clear is that Anaximander was not simply offering an explanation of the world, but quietly reshaping what it means to explain anything at all. His philosophy does not end with a clear, solid foundation that everything can be reduced to. Instead, it leaves behind something more demanding, a way of thinking that accepts that the deepest layer of reality may never fully present itself in a fixed or familiar form. By this stage, his idea of the apeiron is no longer just a starting point. It becomes the center of his entire vision, not as something that can be fully described, but as something that must be acknowledged as the background of everything that exists. It is not an object, not a substance in the ordinary sense, but a condition, a kind of boundless source that allows all forms to emerge without being limited to any of them. This changes the way reality is understood at its most basic level. Instead of thinking in terms of fixed things that exist independently, His philosophy suggests that everything is part of a continuous process of emergence and return. Forms appear, take shape for a time, and then dissolve back into the indefinite. Nothing stands completely on its own. Everything is connected through this deeper movement. This perspective removes the idea of permanence in a very quiet but powerful way. What people take to be stable, whether it is matter, identity, or structure, becomes something temporary, something that exists only within a certain phase of a larger process. Stability, in this sense, is not absolute. It is relative, dependent on time and perspective. At the same time, he does not present this as chaos or disorder. The world is not falling apart into randomness. The processes through which things emerge and dissolve follow a kind of balance, a structure that operates even when it is not directly visible. This is where his idea of justice, introduced earlier, reaches its most complete form. It is no longer just a way of describing how opposites correct each other. It becomes a principle that applies to the entire movement of reality. Nothing can dominate indefinitely. Nothing can escape the balance that is built into the structure of existence. Excess leads to correction. Imbalance leads to restoration. What appears to move beyond its limits is eventually brought back into proportion. This is not something imposed from outside. It is part of how reality sustains itself. This gives his philosophy a kind of quiet stability, not the stability of fixed forms, but the stability of process. Even though everything changes, the movement itself remains consistent. The pattern of emergence, imbalance, and restoration continues. At the same time, he becomes more aware of how difficult it is for human beings to fully grasp this kind of structure. People naturally focus on what is visible, what is immediate, what appears solid and reliable. They build their understanding around forms, around things that seem stable. But in doing so, they often miss the deeper process that makes those forms possible. They see the result, but not the movement behind it. This creates a gap between appearance and reality, where what is taken as fundamental is actually only temporary. He does not offer a simple way to close this gap. Instead, his philosophy suggests that understanding requires a shift in perspective, a willingness to move beyond what is directly given and to think in terms of processes rather than fixed entities. This shift is not easy because it removes a certain kind of certainty. Fixed explanations provide clarity and comfort. The idea of an indefinite foundation, something that cannot be fully defined, introduces ambiguity. But for him, this ambiguity is not a weakness. It is a reflection of the depth of reality itself. The more one tries to reduce everything to simple, concrete terms, the more one risks missing what is most fundamental. He also leaves behind a broader implication about knowledge itself. That understanding is not about reaching a final, unchanging answer, but about moving closer to a structure that remains deeper than any single explanation. This does not make knowledge meaningless. It gives it direction. It becomes a process of refinement, of approaching something that can never be fully captured, but can be increasingly understood. At the same time, his work represents a turning point in the development of philosophical thought. He moves away from explanations based on familiar substances and toward abstraction. He introduces the idea that what is most real may not be what is most visible. This shift would influence later thinkers in ways that are not always immediately obvious. The move toward abstraction, toward underlying principles that cannot be directly observed, becomes a central feature of philosophy and eventually of science. But what remains most distinctive about his thought is its balance between explanation and limitation. He seeks to understand the world, but he does not pretend that it can be fully contained within simple concepts. In the end, what he leaves behind is not a complete system, but a direction, a way of thinking that looks beyond appearances, that recognizes the temporary nature of forms, and that accepts that the foundation of everything may remain indefinite, even as it shapes everything that exists. And within that direction lies a realization that does not settle easily. That the world is not built on something fixed and clearly defined, but on something without boundary, without final form, something that gives rise to everything, sustains it, and eventually draws it back again. Once that idea begins to take hold, even slightly, the way reality is seen begins to shift. What appears stable becomes temporary. What appears separate becomes connected. And what seems fully understood reveals itself as only part of something far deeper, something that cannot be fully grasped, but can never be ignored once it is seen.